Number 5. The Bardstown Murders. Bardstown, Kentucky has been called the most beautiful small town in America by both Rand McNally and USA Today. The town is located between Louisville and Lexington, and at the 2010 census, it had a population of 11,700 people. It is also home to a string of unsolved murders that may or may not be connected. The first murder happened on May 25, 2013. Around 2:30 a.m., Jason Ellis, who was a Bardstown police officer, turned onto exit 34 on the Bluegrass Parkway, which is near Bardstown. Ellis was just finishing his shift and he was taking his usual route home. When he turned onto the exit ramp, he saw that there were some branches lying across it. So he parked his cruiser, turned on his police lights, and started to move the branches. As he moved the branches, someone armed with a 12-gauge shotgun ambushed Ellis and shot him 3 times. Ellis was a 7-year veteran on the force, and he was a husband and a father of 2, and he was just 33 years old. His dead body was found a short time later by commuters, and his gun was still in his holster. Since one of their own was murdered in cold blood, the Bardstown Police Department worked around the clock to find the shooter. The police determined that it was a premeditated murder, and the killer placed the debris in the road. What's interesting about the debris is that it didn't come from the area where the shooting happened, meaning that the killer brought it with them. What the police didn't know was if Ellis was the target, or just a random victim. In the days after the shooting, the police received many tips, but they had no solid leads, and the case went cold. Nearly 11 months later, on April 22, 2014, the staff at Bardstown Elementary School became worried because one of their special education teachers, 48-year-old Kathy Netherlands, didn't come into work. When someone went to check on their house, they found her body, along with the body of her 16-year-old daughter, Samantha Netherlands. The medical examiner determined that the mother and daughter were killed the night before they were found, at about 8 p.m. Kathy had been shot multiple times while her daughter died from blunt force trauma to the head. Both victims also had cuts on their necks. When investigating the brutal double homicide, what puzzled the police was that there was no motive to the murders. Neither the mother nor the daughter had any enemies, and there was no reason why anyone would want them dead. Kathy's husband had died a year before the murders, and the family's other daughter, the only surviving member of the family, was away at college on the night of the murders. The police did have one lead though. A surveillance camera recorded a black 2006 to 2013 Chevrolet Impala near the Netherlands' home shortly after 8 p.m. The Netherlands lived just outside of Bardstown, and the car in the surveillance tape is heading in the direction of Bardstown. The police interviewed hundreds of people and saw hundreds of black Impalas, but it didn't lead to any suspects. On July 4th, 2015, just 14 months after the double murders, 35-year-old mother of 5, Crystal Rogers of Bardstown, was reported missing by her live-in boyfriend, Brooks Houck. Brooks said that he last saw Rogers the night before at about 10 p.m. He said that's when he went to bed, and when he did, Rogers was still awake and she was on her phone. Rogers' 2007 maroon Chevy Impala was found 2 days later on the Bluegrass Parkway. It had a flat tire, and inside the car was Rogers' keys and her purse, but Rogers was nowhere to be found. In October 2015, Rogers' boyfriend was identified as the prime suspect in her disappearance. Later that same month, Brooks' brother, Nick Houck, who was an officer with the Bardstown Police Department, was fired from his job after failing a polygraph test regarding the whereabouts of Rogers. Houck's family's property was searched, but it didn't turn up any traces of Rogers. One person who actively searched for Rogers was her father, Tommy Ballard. On the morning of November 19, 2016, Ballard was hunting with his son on his property just outside of Bardstown. His son was on a different part of the property when he heard a gunshot. He walked towards the sound of the gunshot, and he found his father lying on the ground. Ballard had been killed by a shot to the chest. So far, the police have kept quiet about the investigation into Ballard's death, but Ballard's family says that in the month before he was killed, he said that he was being followed. Ballard's death marks the 5th unsolved death or disappearance in Bardstown since 2013, which is quite a high number considering it has an estimated population of about 14,000 people at the time of this video. Number 4. Janette Roberson. In the spring of 1982, Janette Roberson, her husband, and her 2 children moved to the small town of Reed City, Michigan, which had a population of around 2,200 people. After moving to the town, Janette got a job at a Gamble's department store. She worked in the pet department, which was in the basement of the store. On the afternoon of January 19, 1983, Janette, who was 27, was working alone in the basement. At around 4 o'clock, one of her co-workers went into the basement, and in the back room he found Janette dead on the floor. She had been badly beaten, and she was partially dressed. The medical examiner determined that Janette had been struck with several objects that were never identified, but they were all items that were found in the store. As for the time of death, it was between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Amazingly, even though there were employees and customers upstairs in the store at the time of the attack, no one saw or heard anything suspicious. There was only one man who was seen by 3 different people who might have gone into the basement on that afternoon, and the 3 witnesses described the man to a police sketch artist. Unfortunately, no one recognized the sketch of the man, and his identity is still a mystery. The police also investigated Janette's husband, Alvin, as a possible suspect. At the time of the murder, he and Janette were on the verge of a divorce, and he was seeing another woman. Several months later, he moved away from Reed City and married the woman that he was seeing. Eventually, the police ruled Alvin and his new wife out as suspects, and Janette's family do not think that he was involved. The most likely theory in regards to motive, according to the police and Janette's family, is that the killer may have had romantic feelings for Janette. Janette's family described her as friendly and in some ways naive, and someone may have mistook her kindness as a sign of romantic feelings. They think that on the day she was killed, Janette rejected him and he snapped. He used whatever weapon he could find and raped and beat her to death. The man then walked out of the store, and his whereabouts are currently unknown. The family of Janette Roberson is hoping that one day someone will come forward with information about what happened on that fateful afternoon and hopefully give them some closure. Number 3. Christine Jessop. On the afternoon of October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop was dropped off by the school bus at her home in Queensville, Ontario. Queensville is a small village north of Toronto, and it had a population of no more than 1,000 people. When Christine arrived home, no one was there because her father was at work and her mother was at the dentist with her 14-year-old brother. Earlier in the day, Christine had made plans to meet a friend at a nearby park at 4 o'clock. Sometime between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, Christine left the house, walked to the local store, bought a pack of gum, but she never arrived at the park. When Christine didn't show up at the park, her friend called her home, but there was no answer. At 4:10, Christine's mother and brother returned home, where they found Christine's bike on the ground. Her family searched the neighborhood, and when they couldn't find her, they called the police. Queensville was searched, but there was no trace of Christine. November 21st, 1983 would have been Christine's 10th birthday, and her family had to endure it without knowing where she was. On New Year's Eve, 1983, the family knew that they weren't going to get good news when they saw their minister and the police walking up the driveway. Christine's body had been found in a field about 35 miles east of her home. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed several times. A few weeks after the discovery of the body, the police started to focus their attention on a neighbor of the Jessops, 24-year-old Guy Paul Morin. The police considered him a suspect simply because they thought that he was a strange guy, because he played the clarinet in a band, and as a hobby, he was a beekeeper. They also thought that it was unusual that he didn't help look for Christine or attend her funeral. Eventually, the police developed tunnel vision for him. 2 detectives on the case persuaded Christine's mother and brother to change their story about what time they returned home on the day of the kidnapping. They got home at 4:10 and Christine was already missing, but Morin left work at 3:32 and there was no way he could have made it home any earlier than 4:14. As for physical evidence implicating Morin, the police found 12 microscopic fibers on Christine that were similar to fibers found in Morin's car. Morin was arrested in April 1985 and he went to trial in January 1986. At Morin's trial, 2 men who were locked up with him while he was awaiting trial were called to testify, and they said that he confessed to the murder. The trial lasted a month and Morin was ultimately acquitted. The prosecutor appealed the acquittal and won a retrial. Using much of the same evidence from the first trial, like the testimony from the Jessops, the jailhouse confessions, and the fibers, Morin was tried for murder a second time. This time, he was convicted. Even though Morin was convicted, several legal experts noted that there were a few problems with his case, besides the fact that the police persuaded a grief-stricken family to change their story. First off, the jailhouse informants weren't credible. One of them had been diagnosed as a pathological liar, and the other one was a sex offender looking to get a reduced sentence. Secondly, the fibers that were found on the body had been contaminated by the employees at the Center of Forensic Sciences, and the analysts working on the case knew that the fibers had been contaminated before the first trial. Also, there were fibers that supported Morin's innocence claim, and the analysts at the Center of Forensic Sciences didn't turn them over to the defense team. Morin appealed his conviction, and for the appeal, his DNA was compared to some DNA that was found on Christine's clothes. The DNA excluded Morin as the killer, and he was released from prison in January 1995 after spending 18 months incarcerated. Morin was also awarded $1.25 million in compensation, and the Jessops officially apologized to him. Sadly, after a decade of legal proceedings against the wrong man, the Jessops were no closer to finding out who killed Christine. After Morin was dismissed as a suspect, the police started to investigate a list of over 360 suspects, but today the case is considered cold. The police have a DNA sample from the killer, but they have never been able to find a match. The police think that it's possible that he may be dead or moved away because they do not think that it is likely that the killer would have stopped killing after murdering Christine. Famed FBI profiler John Douglas thinks that Christine probably knew her killer and he may have lured her to his car. Douglas also said that the man was probably in his mid-20s and most likely lived at home. At the time of the murder, he was either having problems with his parents or having problems with his girlfriend. Unfortunately, the profile was not helpful in identifying the suspect. The Jessop family is still holding out hope that the killer will be caught so that justice can finally be served. Number 2. The Boys on the Tracks. 17-year-old Kevin Ives and 16-year-old Don Henry of Alexander, Arkansas were best friends. On the night of August 22, 1987, the two friends went out to do some spotlighting, which is a form of night hunting. Several hours later, at about 4:30 a.m., a train conductor and 3 other crew members aboard a Union Pacific cargo train saw the bodies of 2 young men lying across the tracks. All 4 men saw that the bodies were partially wrapped in a green tarp. The conductor blew his diesel horn, but the young men didn't move. He applied the brakes, but it was impossible to stop the 6,000-ton cargo train in time, and the train ran over the boys. The police were called to the gory scene, and the bodies were determined to be Kevin and Don. The police collected the pieces of the smashed rifle, but they said they didn't find the tarp. The local medical examiner did a blood test on the teens, and he concluded that they smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes and then fell asleep on the tracks. The families of the boys didn't think that the ruling made any sense, and they urged the police to reopen the case. 5 months after the deaths, the case was reopened, and an outside pathologist did a second autopsy. He concluded that the boys smoked 1 to 3 marijuana cigarettes, and they were either unconscious or dead when they were put on the tracks. He also said that Don had been stabbed and Kevin had been beaten with the butt of a rifle. After the second autopsy, the deaths were ruled a homicide. But who had killed the 2 young men, and why were they killed? The first suspect is a mysterious man who wore army fatigues. He was spotted several weeks before the murders near the railroad tracks. When a police officer approached him, the man pulled out a gun and fired off several shots at the officer before running off into the night. Unfortunately, the officer was not able to track the man down, and he got away. Another theory is that the boys were hunting in an area where low-flying airplanes dropped parcels of illegal drug shipments, and Don and Kevin saw something that they shouldn't have seen. The drug angle was never investigated by the police, and that may have something to do with the attorney who spearheaded the murder investigation after the case was reopened. When the case was closed, a lawyer named Dan Harmon met with the families and told them that he could get the case reopened. When it was reopened, Harmon, who was elected in 1991 to the position of prosecuting attorney for the 7th Judicial District, asked to lead the investigation. It turned out that, at the time of the murders, Harmon was involved in drug trafficking and he was extorting money and drugs from local dealers. Despite numerous investigations into his illegal activity, Harmon managed to hold on to his job as a prosecutor until 1996, when he finally resigned after being charged with assault. In 1997, Harmon was convicted of racketeering, extortion, and drug conspiracy, and he received a total of 11 years in prison. At the time of the murders, Harmon was dating a woman named Charlene Wilson, and in a signed statement taken in 1993, Wilson said that Harmon and 2 other men killed Kevin and Don. She also said that she was there that night, and that she did some stabbing herself. A short time later, one of the men that Wilson identified in her statement was killed, and Wilson retracted her statement. Wilson was also convicted for her involvement in the drug trade. In 1993, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and she was paroled in 1999. Harmon was released from prison in 2006, and the police said that they have never considered him a suspect in the murders of Kevin and Don. Despite no one ever being arrested in connection with the double murder, the police say that the case is officially closed. Number 1. Holly Piirainen and Molly Bish. In August 1993, 10-year-old Holly Piirainen, her father, and her 2 brothers were visiting her grandparents' summer home in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, which had a population of about 10,000 people. At 11:45 in the morning on August 5th, Holly and her 5-year-old brother walked down the road to visit a neighbor who had a new litter of puppies. At some point, Holly and her brother got separated, and only her brother returned home. Her father sent her older brother out to look for her, but the only thing that he could find was one of her shoes on the road. By 12:30, the police were notified that there was a missing girl, and a massive search was launched. Sadly, despite the best efforts of the searchers, Holly was nowhere to be found. Holly's disappearance shocked many people who were living in the area, and one person who felt bad for her family was 10-year-old Molly Bish, who lived in Warren, Massachusetts, which is about 10 miles from Sturbridge. Molly wrote a letter to Holly's family that said, "I am very sorry. I wish I could make it up to you. Holly is a very pretty girl. She is almost as tall as me. I wish I knew Holly. I hope they found her." Holly would eventually be found, months later. On October 23, 1993, hunters in a wooded area came across the skeletal remains of the 10-year-old. Unfortunately, finding the body didn't turn up any leads, and the case eventually faded from the headlines. Nearly 7 years later, on June 27, 2000, Molly Bish, who is now 16, was dropped off by her mother at Commons Pond in Warren for her shift as a lifeguard. It was only her second day on the job, and at around noon, Molly disappeared. The biggest search in the state's history was conducted, but 3 years would go by before her skeletal remains were found in a wooded area about 5 miles away from her home. It is unclear if the murders of the 2 girls are connected because there is no physical evidence tying them together, but the cases do share a few similarities. Both were young white females that were kidnapped in broad daylight, about 10 miles away from each other, and both of them were dumped in a wooded area. The 2 cases also share several suspects. The first suspect in both murders is a man named Gerald Bastoni. A private investigator first suggested that Bastoni should be considered a suspect in 2011. The PI was doing some work on a child custody case when he learned that Bastoni had raped his girlfriend's teenage daughter over 100 times in the 1990s. He was convicted of those rapes in 2011, and he was sentenced to 10 to 12 years in prison. It turns out that Bastoni's girlfriend was a real estate agent, and she had a place to rent that was on the same street where Holly's grandparents lived. Bastoni also lived on Commons Pond Road at the same time that Molly went missing from Commons Pond. After several news outlets started to report about Bastoni's possible involvement in the murders of Holly and Molly, he slit his own throat. He survived the suicide attempt, but died of an illness in 2014 while serving his sentence for rape. 2 other suspects in the cases are a set of brothers named Randy and Rodney Stanger. Randy is considered a suspect in Holly's murder, while Rodney is a suspect in the murder of Molly. On the day that Holly went missing, Randy was interviewed by the police, and he answered all their questions. He was interviewed because at the time of the abduction, he was living in the wooded area not far from where Holly went missing. In the years after the murder, Holly's brother, who was with her on the day that she was kidnapped, kept having flashbacks of seeing a man he couldn't place. In 2005, 12 years after the kidnapping, he described the man to a police sketch artist, and it resulted in this portrait. The sketch happens to look a lot like Randy, and the family of Holly didn't know he was a suspect until 2009. As for his brother, Rodney, he was arrested in February 2008 for stabbing to death his girlfriend of 25 years while living in Florida. After his arrest, members of his girlfriend's family went to the couple's trailer to get some personal items, and they found an old wallet. In the wallet was an old Massachusetts firearm identification card that belonged to Rodney, which was renewed 2 months before Molly Bish went missing. The photograph on the ID looks a lot like a strange man that Molly's mother saw hanging around the pond after she dropped her daughter off at work. There is even a possibility that Molly and Rodney crossed paths before she was killed. Molly got her lifeguard certification at the YMCA in Southbridge, which was about 3/5 of a mile away from where Rodney was living at the time. Molly was also known to walk down Rodney Street to go meet her father at his workplace to get a ride home after her certification lessons. A private investigator thinks it's possible that before she was murdered, Rodney chatted with Molly, who was outgoing and friendly, and he found out where she worked. Neither brother has been charged in connection with the murders of Holly and Molly because there is no physical evidence. A final person of interest in the murder of Holly is a man named David Pouliot. The police found DNA evidence that Pouliot was in the area where Holly went missing. The police didn't say what the DNA evidence was, but they did mention that Pouliot liked to hunt and fish in the area where Holly went missing. Pouliot did have a criminal record, but his crimes weren't violent or sexual in nature. Unfortunately, the police were not able to ask Pouliot if he knew anything about the murder of Holly, because the police found out it was his DNA in 2012, and he died of a heart attack in 2003. With so many possible suspects, the police and the victims' families are hoping a witness will come forward and provide some much-needed answers. Thanks for watching this week's video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Sunday. Also, thanks to everyone who already does subscribe. You guys are amazing. If you are interested in watching another video with Unsolved Murders, please click on one of the videos on the screen now. But that's all for this week. Thanks again for watching.